We're on.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome into Deleted Scenes. I am Pastor Jack, and he is
Pastor Matt.
This is where we chat about the most recent week's sermon, some things that just maybe didn't make the cut, or just some questions that I have, or some questions that you have. And you can comment those in the comments section. But that's really what we do here, is we just kind of hang out and chat about things.
Yeah.
Looks a little bit different than it did the week before, but then it still looks different than it did the few weeks before then, because we're always just trying to get better here at Turner Christian Church, always trying to improve things. And so really hoping that sorry, my video was kind of choppy. It's kind of choppy here.
Yeah. Our connection is good.
Maybe it's my computer. I don't know.
It is a Mac. I'm kidding. We won't get into that.
Okay. So, but yeah, that's what we do here. And so I have several questions for Pastor Matt from this most recent sermon called The Last Eyewitness, talking about Paul. And so we're just going to chat about that for a few minutes here. Yeah. And so without further ado, I guess we can get into it.
Let's do this.
All right. So my first question for you, Pastor Matt, is why did Pharisees tend to take other people's faith so seriously?
Yes. This is a good question. So why did they care so much about what the other Jews were doing? And I think a lot of times we just stereotype them because there are people who just do this, who really care about everybody else's business. And I think people like that in ancient Judaism probably gravitated toward the Pharisees, but there was actually a theological reason why they cared what everybody was doing. And I kind of touched on this in the sermon. It had to do with the idea that as with Christians, like people who are Christians, there's a question of who is a Christian. And do you have to choose to be a Christian? Do you have to do certain things? But there's like a membership. You aren't born a Christian. Mm-hmm. You're born a Jew. And so that means that people who have Jewish blood, they're just Jews, and they're part of that relationship. And the idea among the Pharisees was that God was waiting for the Israelites, for all the Jews, to follow the law. And so it mattered whether people who didn't even really believe kept the law. It mattered whether every Jew kept the law properly. And it's kind of like, we were talking about this in a small group last night, and the example that we came up for this is like, if you were in a classroom and everybody was talking and the teacher was waiting for everybody to stop talking, and you just sat there and waited, and there's that one guy. You can't move on until everybody stops talking. There's that one guy, and finally you might turn around and say, dude, be quiet. Like normally you don't get up in other people's business, but this person is holding everybody back. Mm-hmm.
I was that one guy.
Were you? Okay. So and so that's what's going on, I think, with the Pharisees. And so there's a mistaken theological idea behind it.
Sure.
It wouldn't have just been, well, I think I'm in charge of everybody. It was like, no, we have to get this right before the Messiah comes.
Yeah. That kind of brings me into another question that I have for you. And that is this. You kind of bring up the idea of law breakers, and I was just wondering, how would they differentiate between someone who maybe is like intentionally going against the law because they have no intent of following the law, and someone who maybe is just kind of messing up and is not following the law, just that they want to follow, but they just kind of screw up every once in a while?
Well, I think I would say they didn't differentiate.
Okay.
They saw those as the same, and that's part of Jesus's issue with their methodology, is that they don't differentiate between people who are actively rebelling against the law, and Jesus would condemn that. Like Jesus would say that's wrong. To just be actively disobedient is wrong. Yeah. He tells them, keep the law, but you're not supposed to treat people who are making honest mistakes, who are struggling, that way, because Jesus treated them differently. So I think that might be at the kind of core of the difference between Jesus and the Pharisees, because the truth is, Jesus was, on 99 issues out of 100, Jesus was a Pharisee. When you locate him in all the different schools of Judaism at the time, Jesus was almost entirely a Pharisee. But the ways they were different really, really mattered.
Sure.
Sure.
So my next question for you still involves kind of this idea of Pharisees and keeping the law very closely. And I just wanted to ask, how kind of closed off was this religion? Were they accepting to other people who wanted to become Jews, or how did that actually work, and how flexible were people with, kind of outsiders, I guess?
I think there was, like any movement, any group of people, I'm sure there was a spectrum. In general, Judaism has always been open to people converting to it. In fact, from the very beginning, when God makes the covenant with Abraham and tells him to circumcise his family, he tells him to circumcise their slaves and everybody who's part of their household. And from that point on, it has been possible to join Judaism. It has never really been a mission of Jews to bring other people in, because the mindset of the covenant was that people are in the covenant, like the covenant people are doing what they're doing for the sake of everybody outside. Mm-hmm. So it's not a sense of we need to get everybody into the covenant. It's that everybody in the covenant needs to be on point to serve everybody outside the covenant.
Sure.
So they didn't have the same kind of missionary impulse that Christianity has.
Yeah.
There's no sense that Gentiles, in Judaism, there's no sense that Gentiles have to be Jews in order to be saved. Mm-hmm. The idea is that the Gentiles will be saved through what God is doing through the Jews. So Jesus talks about the fact that there were Pharisees who were really passionate about bringing in converts. Mm-hmm. And he says the problem is you'll travel miles and miles to make a convert to Judaism, but you're converting them to this horrible, like he says, you'll make them twice the son of hell as you are, because they're converting them to the wrong thing. That same militant, line-drawing attitude that Paul had.
Yeah. Yeah, so you mentioned Paul there, and kind of want to chat about him for a few minutes here. So if you have any questions, remember that you can comment those in the comments section. Mm-hmm. But first off, talking about Paul, you talk about how he was a zealot, and he very much was a zealot. Mm-hmm. And that means, that he was violently, keyword there, opposed to the mixing of non-Jews and lawbreakers. Was this something that was actually legal, what he was doing? And who would have been upholding this, and who would have maybe been going kind of against these actions that he was doing?
Yeah, so that's a good question. As far as we know, we only have the information that's in the Bible, and so we know that the high priest gave letters to Paul to take to the synagogue where he was going in Damascus. Mm-hmm. And the Jewish authorities, like the Jewish region, did not include Damascus. So he's going into a foreign, it's still part of the Roman Empire, but it's another, like going into a different state. Yeah. The weird thing about politics back then, though, was that for us, we live in a world that is divided up by lines into nation states. And so you are subject to the laws of the place where you are, right? So if as an American citizen, you go to Canada and commit a crime, by Canadian law, the Canadians punish you. Now, the American government might get involved, but the Canadian government has full authority to enforce the laws there, right? In this time, that wasn't quite how it worked. So the Jewish authorities actually were able to collect taxes from people who lived all over the Roman Empire, because there was a sense that that you owed your allegiance not just to where you were, but also to where you came from at all times. And this was something that was common until like 500 years ago. The idea that the place you lived, like your mayor of your hometown, still had authority over you wherever you went to a certain extent. That's why when Pilate finds out that Jesus is from Galilee, he sends him to King Herod, even though they're in Jerusalem. It shouldn't, in our world, it wouldn't matter where he was from. Yeah. So what that means is that Paul can go out into other parts of the Roman Empire and arrest people and bring them back on the authority of the Jewish authorities in Judea. What he can't do is execute them, because as we know from the story of Jesus' execution, the Jews can't actually execute someone without Roman permission. So he went to Damascus to arrest them, bring them back to Judea, to Jerusalem, where they could be tried and punished in whatever way the Jews were able to do.
Sure. Okay. That explains a lot, actually. So the next question involving Paul is, I just want to ask, how his life previous to his transformation on the road to Damascus, how his life before that moment was kind of preparing him for the ministry that he'd do, and maybe even why God chose him to be the person kind of going to the Gentiles and ministering to them.
Yeah. Well, we can infer. Okay, so first of all, in terms of how his background prepared him for the ministry he was going to do, number one, he was born to as a Roman citizen. And being a Roman citizen was a rare and very valuable thing. In fact, when Jesus points this out to a Roman soldier, he says, "How are you a Roman citizen? I had to pay a lot of money to be a Roman citizen." And we don't know, except that it came from his family connections. But it gave him a lot. It's like being a Roman citizen then was like being an American citizen now. Like as an American citizen, you are better protected around the world because if something happens to you, they have to deal with the American government. So that was a big deal. Also, the fact that he was incredibly well educated. He went to the Harvard of his day. And it's interesting, because we talked about Gamaliel. Gamaliel was not a zealot. Gamaliel was actually on the opposite side of, because not all the Pharisees believed the same thing, but the majority of them in Judea believed like the zealots were zealous. Gamaliel was on the other side. So his training was actually in a much more compassionate approach to Judaism, which prepared him for being a much more compassionate Christian.
Sure.
He had an incredible command of the Old Testament. He grew up in a Greek-speaking place, so he was very fluent in Greek. And he had lots of qualifications. He also, because of the story of him persecuting the church, he has some major strikes against him. And so Paul is really going to emphasize those when he tells his story. He says, he wouldn't say, God chose me because I'm qualified, even though he did have qualifications that he used. I think Paul would say, he chose me because I was disqualified. Like I disqualified myself by the way I treated the church, by the things I did, and he chose me to make a point.
Sure.
If he can use me, he can use anybody. If he can bring me back, he can bring anybody back.
Yeah.
And I think that's true with a lot of stories. We talked about that like with Mary Magdalene, that she had a lot going for her in terms of qualifications, but publicly, in terms of the way the world thinks, she was disqualified, and God chose her for that reason. And that's a really common theme in the Bible, that God chooses people, like he prepares people, but he chooses them because the world ignores them, and he's making a point.
Yeah.
So...
All right. So don't forget, you can still comment any questions that you have for Pastor Matt in the comments section, and we will get to those as soon as we can. Kind of moving forward with something that you shared in your sermon, you talked about how this transformation for Paul was an indication and kind of, showed how Christ is alive and really what Christ is doing in the world, or was doing in the world at that time. And I just want to ask, are transformations in our lives today also indications of, Christ being alive and how Christ is working in the world today still?
Absolutely. And I would say that these days, in 2021, as far removed from the resurrection as we are, the most important evidence that we can offer people is lives that are being changed today. And what that means is the believability of the gospel hinges on whether that is visibly true to people. Because if you tell people Jesus is alive today, and you can tell because he changed our lives, and you look at the people who claim that, if their lives aren't changed, you're actually making an argument against the gospel.
Sure.
But personally, I think that one of the hardest things to explain if you're not a Christian is how the world has been so transformed by the Christian movement and how people have been transformed, because Paul is one of millions of examples. And I mean, another one is, I can't believe, John Newton. I'm pretty sure Newton's right. Pretty sure John's right. He was in the 1800s, he was part of the slave trade. He was a captain of a slave ship, and he went through this major transformation in his life, and he ended up becoming a priest, a pastor, and writing the hymn Amazing Grace. And that's a really famous story. And there are story after story after story of people being completely transformed from selfish, from violent, from evil into being selfless and dedicated to others. And you just don't find those stories happening in the West before Christianity.
Yeah.
And in fact, those stories would not have even been celebrated before Christianity. People would have thought that was a horrible change. That would have been a change for the worse, because you're becoming weak and you're serving people that are less important than you. So I would say, yeah, that the stories of our lives being transformed is the best evidence we have.
Sure. Yeah. So, kind of moving more so into a application kind of section here, and just how these types of things apply to our lives. First off, one of the things I think Paul is really known for is how he corrects churches that he goes to, and how he kind of confronts them about issues that are going on within their church.
Yep.
And I just want to ask, and this is actually something that we kind of touched on a little bit during the Unity Project. This most recent week, is how do we go about correction in the church in a healthy way? Because I feel like there's a lot of times where correction in the church it just isn't done very well, or that people see it and say that's not done very, very well. And so, just from your experience, insight, how might you suggest that the church or our church could go through correction in a healthy way?
I think that. I'm not an expert or a master in any of this. I'm very new in my journey as a pastor. So the one thing that really stands out to me that I've learned from looking at Scripture is that we have to keep the main thing. And the main thing in reconciliation is reconciliation. And unfortunately, throughout Christian history, we have a tendency when we go into conflicts to make winning the main thing, or getting everyone to agree is the main thing. And unfortunately, this is one of those ways that Paul has been very badly misused, because often it's usually the writings of Paul that we use to justify divisions. The Protestant reformers did it. Every schism we've experienced since then pretty much has been over an issue that's grounded in Paul. And the problem is that we're not paying attention to what Paul is doing in those passages, because Paul never condemns someone as a false teacher simply for believing something different. Mm-hmm. He does confront a lot of false teachers. We're going to talk about that in this next sermon, where we're going to be in Titus. The sermon after that, there's false teachers in Corinth. There's a lot of times that he confronts in very strong language false teachers. But they are always people who are teaching something that is wrong and is destructive, or they're teaching it for selfish reasons. Mm-hmm. It's always because what they're doing is damaging to the unity of the church. He never comes down hard on people for sincerely disagreeing with him. That never happens. And every time he deals with people who sincerely disagree, he's telling them, this happens in 1 Corinthians and in Romans, he's telling them, be nice to each other, love each other, live together in different opinions. Like he never says expel the person for disagreeing. And so whenever we have gone through church discipline and basically cut people out for disagreeing with us, that has been a misuse of Paul. But Paul will absolutely say, put that person out of the church. In Titus, we're going to see this. He says, have nothing more to do with that person, because what that person is doing is harmful to the unity of the church. Sometimes to protect unity, you have to remove divisive people. But it always has to be for the sake of maintaining the unity of the church and the ministry of reconciliation.
Yeah. So you mentioned this idea of reconciliation. Mm-hmm. And, it was kind of one of the, I think, large topics and points of your most recent sermon. And so I just wanted to ask, what role specifically does unity and reconciliation play in the gospel story?
In the story of Jesus?
Yeah.
So I would say, and this is part of the basis for doing this series, is that it is central to the message, the story of what Jesus is doing. And Paul definitely agrees. And I know we've talked about this a couple of times in sermons. I can't remember how recently it is. So at a certain point, I'm going to stop apologizing for repeating myself, because some things are just really central. I know every pastor ends up with favorite passages, and I need to just accept that I'm like those pastors. So Paul in Ephesians chapter 2, he says, let's see, where is it? Ephesians 2:13, but now in Christ Jesus, he's talking to Gentiles and telling them about how they've been brought together with Jews. And he says, Now in Christ Jesus, you who are far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace, who made both groups one and tore down the dividing wall of hostility in his flesh. He made in his flesh he made of no effect the law consisting of commands and expressing regulations, so that he might create in himself one new man from the two, resulting in peace. He did this so that he might reconcile both to God in one body through the cross, by which he put the hostility to death. So what this passage is saying is that the reason Jesus did what he did was so that he could bring people together and reconcile them to each other, and then reconcile humanity to God. That is very central to why he did it through the cross and why he saves us through grace. He saves us through grace because it puts us all on an equal footing. Yeah. And it means that none of us can claim to be better than others. And in reality, not only is the idea of reconciliation central to the story of Jesus, it's central to the story of the entire Bible. If you look at Genesis 1 through 11, which I know you guys are going through Genesis in youth group,
yep,
that is the story of the disintegration of humanity, of going from the perfect unity of Adam and Eve to the absolute chaos of the aftermath of the Tower of Babel. It's the story of the disintegration. And then starting in Genesis 12 is the story of it being put together. And that first promise to Abraham is that he will be a blessing to the nations. He is going to be the point around which God brings people back together. And that continues at every single stage through the rest of the Bible, that's what God's doing.
Sure.
And the amazing thing to me that boggles my mind nowadays is that somehow I got to seminary. I would live my life in the church, and I got to seminary before I understood that was central to the message. And it wasn't even in seminary, like in a seminary class, where I made this realization. It was through some reading that was recommended to me while I was at seminary, to realize that this is at the core of what the Bible is saying and doing.
Yeah.
There are a lot more resources now that are pointing this out, though. The Bible Project is really good at drawing this theme out, and also the New Testament scholar that I'm most drawing on for this current series that we're going into is N.T. Wright, and he talks about that a lot.
Yeah, one of the things that I kind of just in going through Genesis in the youth group, that's kind of the content that's on my mind. And so since I'm doing the communion meditation this week, kind of whatever is on your mind kind of tends to be what falls into your communion meditations. And I'll just talk about how, I was in Bible college when I came to the realization that this is like one story, right? I mean, I heard all growing up, it's a collection of different, writings from thousands of years and whatnot. And then I finally realized, like, this is one single story, and we are taking it from, the history of God's chosen people, which then extends to everybody in the New Testament. And it's this story of it's this one story of one guy and one plan that has salvation and unity just at the core of everything within that one story. And so that was a really cool realization, just like saying, well, we start off with, the formation of God's chosen people of Israel, and then kind of move forward and just see how, that story plays out. We follow their successes and their many, many failures. And then we get into the New Testament and see Jesus and how that plan unfolds and extends to humanity. And that was just a really cool thing to realize. But
it's kind of a mind-blowing thing. Yeah.
So it's almost as if it was planned, and put together by some divine source or something like that.
Yeah.
So don't forget, you can comment any questions you have in the comments section. I have one more question to ask of you, Pastor Matt.
Okay.
And that it's still on this idea of reconciliation. And I was just hoping, you being a pastor, maybe you could give us some sort of image of what does it look like? What does working towards reconciliation actually look like in an applied sense? Maybe there's some sort of example of a broken relationship that found reconciliation. But what is some sort of example or story that might help us understand what working towards reconciliation really looks like?
Oh, that's not how I took the question when we talked about it. It's okay. I would have thought of a specific story. I know working towards reconciliation, I think I mean, there's a lot of examples throughout history, and I would have a lot more names come into mind if I had actually prepared for that. Because like some of the bigger, more public things would be like the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was mainly grounded in Christian theology and in the conviction that God doesn't want us separated the way we are. And yeah, man, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on specific stories. So I can speak in hypotheticals about what I think it looks like in our lives.
Sure.
That building reconciliation, it means, I think for us a lot today, it means changing the way people talk about each other.
Mm.
I think the big challenge that we have is we just talk about each other in such negative ways. And if we can just first and foremost change the way we talk about each other, I think that makes a huge difference. Yeah, sorry, read me that question one more
Sure.
time.
What does working towards reconciliation look like?
The big thing that it looks like that has been unique to Christian history is it looks like going and being among the people that are different from you, seeking out that group that is different from you, whether it's a missionary going into a culture that they're not a part of, or a white person going into a black community and serve, a person from a wealthy background going into neighborhoods that are really suffering and serving in that way. People who are healthy going in, like the very idea of a hospital comes from Christians who were willing to go into places like leper colonies where people were sick. There's that, and that's following the example of Jesus. The ultimate example of reconciliation is Jesus reconciling with humanity and God reconciling with humanity by coming here. Jesus didn't wait for us to come to him. He came to us even though we were the ones in rebellion, and he cared about us, and his heart broke for us, and he was willing to serve us. And that is an incredibly powerful example that has driven so much of the good things that have happened in the history of humanity since then. So many people who have done important and good things for their fellow humans, it's been because they were following that example of Jesus, to go out to the world, to seek out people that are in need, seek out people that they've been alienated from, and serve. And ultimately, I think a lot of what reconciliation looks like is serving people that have wronged us, serving people that have hurt us, serving people that we really don't like. Mm-hmm. I think that's what that work looks like a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of the time.
Thank you for that. That concludes all of my questions. And so just to give you a brief moment to comment any questions that you still might have in the comment section. Maybe if you'd like to, Pastor Matt, tell us why there's a Rubik's Cube on the table.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. So that is I did solve that, although I'm not solving it without help yet. I have a cheat sheet that I use. That is going to be a key what's the word? Illustration in this coming series. And basically, I'm going to talk about how the method you use to solve a Rubik's Cube is a lot like the method that we use that we learn from Scripture to bring reconciliation in relationships.
Sure.
And so I think that this is a good metaphor for where we want to be. Mm-hmm. And this is a good metaphor for where we've ended up over the past 14 months and what the past 14 months or so has done to our lives. And so I think, I'm going to, if you've watched this before the sermon, then you'll be able to watch for this, that I'm setting myself the challenge of at least partially solving this while I'm preaching. And it's really hard to sound eloquent, to get a clear thought coming out of my mouth while I'm thinking about the moves that I have to do.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's some insider baseball you can be watching and either rooting for or against me as I'm doing that challenge, because I'm not going to draw attention to that part. But yeah, that is why we have a Rubik's Cube.
There we go.
I figured because we moved to this table format and there's just empty table space, so I thought we could just like throw a random object on there every week and see what happens.
Yeah.
Oh, that's one more thing we can talk about. Through the window here is oh no, I've forgotten the name of it. This is the very fancy church that is built on the place where they believe where they believe Paul was buried.
Ah.
It's like the cathedral, the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls is what they call it, because
sounds right.
They took him outside the walls and executed him. And
sure.
Yeah. So
fascinating. We come to you from all over the world, apparently.
Yes.
So, all right. Well, that concludes all of my questions, and I don't see any more questions in the comments section. So, I believe that will conclude our time.
There was one last funny thing. I had to turn this the right way because I had a green face showing when it was up there.
Oh, yeah, that would not work well.
It just looked like the hardwood floor.
So what happens when you like turn it? I guess I can't see it in live time.
No, it'll take a second.
I have to wait a little bit here for that.
There you go. You can look on my screen, see how the squares are wooden. Yep.
That's fun.
Yeah. Fun.
There you go. That's why I was wearing a different shirt earlier. And I don't know what types of greens, if it's all greens, but it was a very dark, like kind of mossy green. Mm-hmm. And I was worried that, I'd just be see-through if I was sitting here. So I went home and I changed. It also was kind of more of a dress shirt, and I don't like dressing like that. So I just went home and changed into one of my favorite hoodies.
Because you filmed your communion meditation.
Yes, I did. So, all right. Well, I believe that is a wrap. That concludes all the questions, and there are none from the comment section. So, Pastor Matt, would you care to sign us off?
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. Stay healthy, stay hopeful, and go in peace to love and serve the Lord. See you Sunday.